Hey everybody, it's now time for the final lecture of the module in Module 8, Research Methodology. So this is one of my favorite areas to talk about. I actually teach CCJ 3701, Research Methods in Criminology. There are awesome skills that you learn in that class. It's required for your major. And we also teach research methods in sociology, right? So these are some of the most important classes that you take as you get ready to graduate because they're skill-based classes on how we actually do social research. So I'm just going to take you on a very quick tour of some of the research methodology that you would want to use in your organization, your program evaluation, or your grant evaluation that you're going to do so that you can kind of connect the why and how that we teach you what we do and look at these skills as very employable skills in the job market. So let's take a look. So first we're going to briefly cover qualitative methods to assess community issues. These methods are really popular when it comes to doing projects out in the community. So we're going to kind of go through these just a little bit. So what are qualitative methods of assessment? Qualitative methods are really those results that really can't be expressed in numbers per se. They're really expressed in experience and kind of the humanistic approach. So we talk about depth and breadth, covering the story of lived experience and illustrating the why and the how of social life. So that's kind of qualitative in a nutshell if I were to describe it to somebody. In contrast to quantitative, which we obviously can quantify, we can enumerate and apply more broadly and generally across larger populations. So qualitative methods include things like individual and group interviews, observation, focus groups, community meetings, and interpretation of records, transcripts, and other quantitative data. So it's a very interpretive approach to social behavior and social experiences. In order to make your qualitative results as reliable as possible, you need to report accurately and completely and be as transparent as you can about the interpretive process you used to determine the outcomes. Frame the right questions and direct them appropriately. So make sure it's very clear to people looking over your work what questions you sought to answer. Use qualitative methods specifically to obtain information that you can't get from quantitative methods. Again, quantitative gets after the what, the where. Qualitative gets more after the why and the how. How did something happen, the process by which something happened rather than if it happened, right? Because if you're interviewing 30 people, we can't necessarily let 30 people represent 500,000 that live in the city, right? Because that wouldn't necessarily translate that way. But it can give us ideas as to some of the things going on at that in-depth personal level. So use the method that can best help you understand and answer the questions that you're asking. And you want to sort out your own and other subjective feelings and comments from objective reality and try to make sure that your findings are objective. That's one of the most difficult things to do in social research is really separate yourself from what you're studying because we come with a moral compass. We come with our own preconceived notions, our own interpretations of meaning, and our own boundaries, our own perceptions. And it's really hard to keep all that at bay while we're in the middle of observing behavior. And we do it to the best of our ability and really let the behavior authentically present itself as much as possible and try to limit any influence or interaction effects that can occur, although we acknowledge that that does happen from time to time. But we try to let behavior be behavior for its own sake. So why use qualitative methods of assessment? Well, they can answer questions that quantitative can't. They're very intriguing to read, and they're very humanizing to encounter. They connect directly with the population and the community you're concerned with. They get at the underlying realities of the situation, something that maybe sometimes a survey can't really uncover. They involve the population of interest or the community at large in helping assess the needs and issues of that community. They allow for a broader examination of the situation or the community than quantitative methods do because they contextualize the places and experiences by which things happen. They allow for what we call the human factor. So it keeps people from being kind of robotic or quantified and makes them, again, more relatable to us. When also would we use qualitative methods of assessment? Well, when what you need is qualitative, descriptive information, you need high levels of detail. When you're trying to understand the reasons and motivations for people's behavior or how they operate in particular situations. When you're analyzing quantitative data and trying to extract meaning out of it. When you're trying to develop suggestions and recommendations. when you want to involve the community in assessment as directly as possible and do things like interviews and focus groups, when you're doing community-based participatory research, involving the community directly in planning and implementing assessment, which we've talked about in previous lectures. So those are very qualitative approaches. So how do you use qualitative methods of assessment? Well, you decide what it is you want to know, choose the method best suited to finding that information, and we'll talk about each of these methods in detail shortly. Choose the people who will gather the information and, if necessary, train them. And we'll talk about some of my experiences I've had as a qualitative researcher as well. Determine from whom and from where you need to gather the information, and that comes into setting. So we talk about maybe the most appropriate setting to do this. And then, of course, just gathering the information. So again, we're just going to look at a few in just by way of introduction, and then we'll go through these in a lot more detail in a few moments. But for interviews, it is really important to let the interviewee choose the space because that addresses their own comfort level with talking to you. Dress for the comfort of the interviewee. Sometimes if we go business professional, then it makes things a little bit stiff and it frames their answers accordingly. It might be better to dress more casually, and also vice versa. If you're entering a professional space and you're not dressed professionally, that might be insulting to the interviewee. So you have to think about what is going to keep everyone comfortable and relaxed to provide accurate, truthful information. Make sure you get permission beforehand to audio record, photograph, or video record the interview. And it's good to actually say that during the recording that you've received that permission and consent to record, so you have a detailed record of that. Also, record carefully the time, place, circumstances, and details of the interview because they provide the context. Think out and frame your questions very carefully and ask directly for the information you're seeking. Don't beat around the bush because that's frustrating to the person trying to answer your question. They're having trouble understanding what you're after. Again, for interviews, you want to ask very open-ended questions to let them tell their story and fill in the blanks. We use things called probes where we might say, can you tell me more about that, or can you elaborate, so that we can get a little bit more information that can more completely answer the question we have. You have to be a very good listener. Don't cut people off too quickly. Be very mindful of interruptions. Sometimes when we probe, we interrupt, and we have to be careful not to do that. Especially if you're in a video conference format, sometimes we cross-talk a little bit and talk over each other without realizing it. So be very, very careful to do that, or also when you're on the phone, because you can't see people breathing or about to speak, obviously, and you might be talking over them, which often alienates the interviewee. Confirm what you're told by checking with others to the extent that you can. So sometimes you have to do some verification in the middle of the interview to kind of double check. Well, you mentioned this. Is this accurate, or did I record this properly? In group interviews, you can facilitate by encouraging everyone to participate, preventing any one person from dominating the space, and keeping the focus on issues and opinions rather than personalities. That's tough to do because we have to navigate social perceptions of ourselves and how we present ourselves, how we react to others. So group interviews are a little bit tricky to do, but they're also very informative. For observation, if you're going to go out into a community and observe them having experiences with interventions or activities, think carefully about the questions that you want your observation to answer. What are you after? What do you want to see? Determine where and whom to observe and answer these questions. Determine when and for how long the observation should take place. And one thing you want to think about is time, season, time of day, whether it's a weekday, a weekend, holiday. Those kind of things matter with the kind of behaviors that are in front of you. You have to think about whether you want to be transparent about it or you want to kind of maybe go in more covertly, where people assume you're part of the population that's supposed to be there rather than someone watching everybody. It's definitely, I call it kind of the reality TV phenomenon. People start performing for you, which is a little bit outside the accurate information that you're seeking. So be mindful of that. Determine what you should observe and record your observations. Often I bring a notebook with me into the field where I have to do a lot of jotting. If it's a little bit too disruptive for me to sit there and take notes while people are all doing their activities, then I have to kind of commit to memory the things that I see and basically do a brain dump. Go back to my car or to my space and actually just jot everything I saw because I didn't want to interrupt the activity at the time. Of course, there are drawbacks to that. You can forget things, but if you go ahead and do that immediately after the observation, it can help preserve those memories. Make sure you analyze the information for patterns and themes that emerge based on what you saw, and then make out and carry a plan to address the issue or problem that you've identified by virtue of that observation. So now we're going to take the time to go into a few areas, and I'm just going to quickly highlight the ones we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about conducting focus groups, conducting surveys, conducting interviews, using public records and archival data, conducting needs assessment surveys, SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and then we're going to kind of wrap with creating and using community report cards. So again, these are just different ways to get after all the information you seek when you're doing research in your job. So let's get started with conducting focus groups. So what is a focus group? You've probably heard of them. We use them in market research all the time. A focus group is a small group discussion guided by a trained leader used to learn more about opinions on a designated topic and then guide future action. So it's a group of people all talking about things together, but there's usually a facilitator that's guiding the discussion. How are focus groups actually different from just regular groups that are talking and then you're observing them talking? Well, they're focused on a specific topic, so you're steering the conversation. They have a trained facilitator. They usually have some kind of focus group instrument or topic guide that needs to be followed during the experience. Members of the group are encouraged to talk openly about their opinions and respond to other members, so they can create a lot of dialogue. It's important to record your focus group because you can't possibly write that fast when everyone's talking one after another so quickly and responding to each other, but it's really dynamic. It's a lot of fun to run a focus group. When should you use them? Definitely when considering introducing a new program or service, because you can gauge feedback and response and receptiveness to that. You can use it when the main concern is depth or shading of opinion, when you're thinking about kind of the, again, perception of how something will be received, or people maybe being hesitant to engage. You can kind of get a pulse check on that. And you can also use a focus group when you want to ask questions that can't easily be asked or answered in a written survey. And it might just be easier to talk about it rather than choose from a pre-selected list of answer choices in a survey. Maybe there's just too much other category out there that needs to be dialogued about in a focus group, and it's more conversational to do so. So that's when you want to use a focus group. So how to conduct a focus group. This is kind of before, during, and after. Before the meeting, you have to recheck your goals. Make sure you don't just put all your eggs in one basket and say, well, this is how it's going to be. You need to consider other methods if for some reason this doesn't work out and you fall on your face doing it. Make sure you have a good backup plan. You need to find a good leader. You need to designate someone as a recorder or implement a recording device, again, seeking consent in advance to do so. You need to decide who should be invited. Decide about incentives. Are you going to compensate people for their time or reward them for participation? A really easy one is food. Although sometimes as people are munching away on food during the focus group, sometimes it inhibits people talking. So maybe you break at one point and let everyone enjoy a snack or lunch or a meal. And or you do that after the focus group is over. So again, you don't want to fill people's mouths when you want people to talk. Decide on the meeting particulars so everybody knows the space and where. Prepare your questions, design your focus group guide, recruit your members, review the arrangements. Think about setting as well. You don't want it to be too hot, too cold, uncomfortable, because people might be sitting there for quite a long period of time, and you want to make sure that they don't fall asleep because it's just so warm in there. You want to make sure that they feel comfortable in that setting. And so you tell them about that ahead of time. How to conduct a focus group. So when you actually do it during the meeting, when the group meets, of course, thank people for coming. Honestly, they're giving you their time and attention and sometimes kind of risking their opinion in front of a group, which can be a very courageous thing to do. So be genuine, I should say, in thanking people for their participation. Review the group's purpose and goals so everyone's on the same page when you begin. Explain how the meeting will proceed, the format it's going to take, and how members can contribute. Some groups have people called upon by the facilitator, or they're recognized when they're allowed to speak, or maybe their microphone is muted or turned off. You have to come up with the actual logistics of how you want to run it. Or maybe it's kind of just a very small group and it's open forum and you're all in a room and you're just going to have a recorder in the middle. So you have to help them understand the rules of engagement in the focus group. Set the tone by asking an opening question and making sure all opinions on that question are heard. So you don't want to kind of skip past people. If there's a way to land their input and their conversation, you want to have that because that's valuable data. Obviously, we have time limitations that we have to think about. And so encourage people if they share an opinion or they want to reinforce an opinion or piggyback off another opinion, tell them to recognize that so that that can make it easier for you to capture all that's going on. Ask further questions in the same general manner. So again, that's probing and prompting for more. When all your questions have been asked, ask if anyone has any other comments to make so that you give them the opportunity to respond. Tell the group about any next steps that will occur and what they can expect to happen now. Oftentimes it's appropriate research protocol to give them a transcript that lets them see what happened in the group. Sometimes we have to do some de-identification or we have to do some editing of the transcript, but they are sometimes entitled to have a copy of it. It's their data and we want to empower them with their own data. They also need to make sure they understand the rules of dissemination or sharing of that data. So you need to think about some of those kind of particulars before maybe you share. And then again, thank the group for coming once it's over. And hopefully you have some kind of incentive or reward or thank you gift in place that they can enjoy when they're finished. After the meeting meets, make a transcript or written summary of the meeting, examine the data for patterns, themes, new questions, and conclusions. Share the results in some way that with the group. Again, you don't have to necessarily release the transcript, but you could at least share some of the overall takeaways that they may find useful. And again, very validating that they were heard, that they mattered, and it encourages them to participate in focus groups in the future. And especially if they're community-based members and doing participatory research, it's going to further empower them to continue to be active and involved in your project. Use the results, right? Use them to inform your project, to continue to make good decisions about the activities and how to plan for future events. Now we're going to go into conducting surveys. So again, this might seem like, research basics. I know what a focus group is, Jensen. I know what a survey is, but we want to talk about best practices when it comes down to suddenly you're in a new job and your boss says, hey, you're a sociology or a criminology major. You know how to do social research. Hey, could you throw a survey together that tells us how to do this? Or we're seeking a grant and I think we need to run a focus group as part of the evaluation. Well, you majored in some of that stuff. Can you run this for us? So we want to make sure that you understand that you could be called upon to do this in your job and you might need some basic strategies to think about how to go about it. So conducting surveys. What are surveys? It's just a way of collecting information that you hope represents views of the whole group in which you're interested. There can be all kinds of questions in a survey, but essentially a survey is a way to get a broad representation. So when we survey land, we're covering a whole area and trying to be very exhaustive in that coverage. Surveys for people are the same way. It's kind of information mapping, if you will. I'm trying to collect information that represents everyone. There's three main methods. You can do case study surveys. You can do sampled surveys, which are probably the most common way that you're familiar with. And then we have things like census surveys that go out to everyone every year, right? And we kind of have very basic information we collect on that. So why conduct a survey? Well, because you want to learn about behaviors, needs, and opinions of people. You can also learn about experiences, attitudes, reactions. One of my favorite things to do in a survey is ask about hypotheticals. So sometimes we learn about what did you do in the past? What are you currently thinking or experiencing? But sometimes we can ask the question stating a certain situation or context and say, if this was you in the future, what would you do? And I love that because it helps us kind of get their orientation as to a planned approach or a planned behavior. So they don't feel like they have to kind of admit or confess things that maybe might not be the best representation of them or maybe even a little unpleasant. We call that social desirability. But they can kind of do hypothetically, not having to fully commit to actually doing it, but what they're thinking right now. So that's kind of fun too. So you can actually ask about future, past, and present. You're going to measure things like client satisfaction or experience using tools, interventions, events, and it really adds credibility to research because you have feedback directly from people on their own experiences. So when should you conduct a survey? Well, it's a great way to get information quickly and efficiently to a lot of people all at once at the same time. When you need statistically valid information about a large number of people, you get lots of quantities of data that can be analyzed with statistical software. Or when you can't get the information you need from other means. So a survey is a good way to be kind of a catch-all to getting it. So when you prepare a survey, you have to decide on the purpose of the survey, whom you're going to survey, and come up with a sampling design of how you're going to bring the survey to those people. You need to decide on what method you will use to collect your survey data. It can be a written survey, a web-based survey, maybe an oral survey that's administered. So you have to think about your time and how labor-intensive it is. You need to write up your questions. And again, questions can be open-ended, tell your story. They can be close-ended, right? Where it's just kind of a yes or no question. Did this happen or that happen? It can be a multiple choice question that offers a pick list of options that they have to decide. Or it can be a Likert scale style question where they're kind of gauging a measurement from strongest to weakest or from most to least and giving you a sense of where they are at. One other thing that is my favorite tip to share with students when preparing surveys is a good way to make sure that you are exhaustive in providing answer choices to people to select from in a multiple choice question is to provide an other category and not just give them an other category if for some reason those answer choices don't fit them, but not only say other, but say other, please specify. So that way they're not just saying other, I don't fit any of these other pre-selected choices. They're saying other, and this is who I am. So they're actually providing you analyzable data that you might be able to create a new category out of or a new answer choice from. So don't just give people kind of an escape hatch by saying other. Ask them to specify what they mean by other and why they feel that their response doesn't fit the set of responses that you prepared. In distributing a survey, there's a lot of ways to do this. Direct mail, interviews, and phone surveys. We've participated in those, I'm sure, in our lifetime. You can use drop boxes, web-based forms, email solicitation. A popular program we use on campus is Qualtrics. You can use media distribution, mailers, flyers, convenience sampling, that's kind of person on the street where you survey whoever walks by, group administration where you have a whole team going out. I actually did group administration at a prison. So we passed out surveys to nearly 300 inmates inside a prison. And because we couldn't do electronic means of collecting the data because a lot of electronics are considered contraband in prison, we had to use pencil and paper. We had to have a very strict way of administering the survey. But yeah, you have to be flexible given sometimes the constraints by which a survey is administered. So again, because we couldn't use devices, we had to go back to a good old-fashioned pencil and paper method. And that meant we had to be really good decipherers of handwriting because some of the handwriting was a little messy to read. And sometimes we couldn't use data that was written in a way that was kind of sloppy. We often had inmates that said, hey, my pencil's getting worn out. They were writing so much down in their survey, they actually needed a pencil sharpener because, or their eraser went bad. It was kind of funny, the kind of things we encountered in the prison when we surveyed inmates. So I've had a lot of different survey experiences, actually. I've written many, many surveys, surveyed many, many kinds of people from different circumstances, different backgrounds, different experiences. It's really been an incredible experience for me. Collecting the surveys, of course, you have to have a means of gathering the incoming surveys, review the return surveys, and then secure a larger return if necessary. You have to have prompts and reminders built in. Hey, the survey is going to close by this deadline. Make sure you go in and do it. You have to have a way of handling incomplete surveys. That also matters. Or incentives for completing a survey. I've learned that people don't like the chance of winning something. They like winning something. So you have to think about whether you have incentives or thank you gifts for giving them your time, which can be sometimes a lot for them to fill out a whole survey. And then finally, analyzing the results. You also want to add up the results, display it in a table. And those are things like frequencies and crosstabs that we teach you how to do in our research methods classes. You need to try to find some patterns. Look at what the most common experiences are. What are the least common experiences? They can tell you something too. Look at the overall survey to see how the percentages compare across the responses. Summarize the results in a one-page report. So that way you have a good executive summary that you can say, this is kind of just some big takeaways, leadership that we got from the survey. Share with your staff and get their feedback and then decide what to do with the results, how you're going to move forward. Next, we'll move into conducting interviews. Wow, this is an experience. So what is an interview? It's a conversation with a purpose. That's all it is. You're trying to get information from somebody. It's not an interrogation, it's an interview, right? So we don't want to set them off in a defensive manner. We want them to feel rapport and trust with us and be willing to share and be collegial in how they interact. So interviews are really not the best option when it's large scale. I mean, can you imagine trying to conduct 500 interviews? That would take a small army of people to do. If you need numeric data, interviews aren't necessarily going to yield that. There are too many traps. Um, so if there are kind of baited questions or questions that feel threatening or negative, don't do an interview because you're going to have some very unpleasant experiences along the way. Or the interviewee has an agenda. If they're here to kind of bang the drum and toe the party line and kind of, do that, it might not be good to give them a microphone. It might be time to mute them. So you have to kind of think about those kind of things ahead of time. Decide carefully whom you should interview because again, once the interview started, it's kind of hard to terminate the interview halfway through without smashing someone's hopes and dreams and helping them feel completely invalidated for sharing things that maybe you felt like weren't yielding any results you were after. So you don't want to cancel out someone's human soul because you don't like how the interview is going. That doesn't feel really good. So if you're really thoughtful about who you choose for an interview ahead of time, you can kind of avoid that awkward situation. Types of interviews, of course, we do them face-to-face, but you can also do them via telephone or video conference. And again, be mindful of the behaviors that are going to yield good listening skills, interaction, probing and prompting for more elaboration on a topic, and being willing for them to go long, because once people start sharing and the juices are flowing, they often go longer than you plan on. So when you're conducting an interview, it's important to practice. Really talking through those questions ahead of time and coming up with the phrasing you need. You need to understand if the interview questions are strict and need to be offered word for word, or if they are semi-structured and allow you to elaborate or reframe or describe in different ways. So make sure you understand how strict that interview guide is. Be willing to engage in small talk. People can't feel comfortable if you're robotic and you're just going through questions in a manner that's very stiff and strict. So sometimes you have to kind of do a little bit of warm up as you engage with people, especially people you are not familiar with. Be very natural. You have to be yourself. People can see through a facade. They have a good sense of whether you're being genuine and authentic or whether you're just using them for data. And that doesn't feel good. You don't want to share when you're in that setting. Make sure you look really sharp and attentive when you're doing an interview. Try to maintain eye contact, demonstrate that you're doing active listening, use respect, be mindful of ways you frame things or assumptions you make about someone's answers, ask for clarification, and don't put things in ways that might be artificial or maybe insulting. I tell people never take yes or no answers during an interview. That's what a survey is for. That's called a closed-ended question, which we use sometimes. But in an interview, that's not the kind of answer we want. We want open-ended questions that describe in detail people's lived experiences. So don't take yes or a no. You might want to ask questions like why, how, or tell me more about, or can you further describe? So you start to learn shortcuts for prompts that can get a little bit more detail out there. And that also takes some practice. Keep your goals in mind because again, as people start going, it's easy to veer off track and have a runaway train going on. Problems with questions, be mindful of intimidating questions, questions that assert power or authority or make assumptions about somebody that maybe aren't true or that are just plain insulting. Be careful of two-in-one questions. We call those double-barreled questions. So maybe we're trying to accomplish too much in a question and we really need to break it down and separate components of the question to isolate topics that we aren't going to step all over in our response. Think about complex questions, and we had to do this with our inmates because obviously this population comes from varying educational backgrounds. And so we had to think about phrasing and vocabulary with a group of people that might have varying levels of education or may not understand terminology. So we have to think about what is understandable, what is relatable to people, and the questions that they're going to be able to respond to. Same thing with people that are from underprivileged backgrounds, people that are younger, people that are older, people that maybe have trouble hearing things. So you have to be kind of ready to have a set of questions that are going to work for them and the needs that they have. Think about question order. If it's a sensitive question or a question that gets after very private or maybe risky information that you're asking them to disclose, don't lead with those questions. Don't start with them. So you want to kind of do some questions, getting them comfortable and warming them up and getting them sharing before you get into the stuff that's a little more sensitive or a little more risky to share. Because they're not just going to come out of the gate and disclose things that are going to put them at risk, because they have to develop rapport and trust with you and know that you have their best interest in mind before they're willing to disclose things that could be highly consequential for them. And then again, by virtue of summary, determine what you want out of the interview, again, leading with those goals. Discuss possible questions, draft your questions, decide on interviewees, and train your interviewers to be solid in their performance of the interview. Contact the interviewees, make the appointments and arrangements of how the interview will occur, and then finally analyze the data when you're done. So we're going to go ahead and stop here, and we will do part 2, where we talk about public records and archival data, conducting needs assessment surveys, SWOT, and community report cards in a part 2 of this lecture. So that way you get a chance to take a brief break. So we'll see you in part 2.